Good afternoon. Wonderful to be with you here today. Our scripture reading today is from the second book of Samuel, chapter 6, and let me set it up. King David, who earlier took down Goliath, dressed not in rigid armor, but only in his loincloth, vulnerable, near naked, and yet surprisingly powerful, this same David has occasion here to celebrate, and so he dances, once again scantily dressed. Now here is 2 Samuel verses 6 verses 20 to 23, as translated with more modern language in The Message. David returned home to bless his family. Michal, Saul's daughter, came out to greet him. How wonderfully the king has distinguished himself today, exposing himself to the eyes of the servants' maids like some burlesque street dancer. David replied to Michal, "In God's presence, I'll dance all I want. He chose me over your father and the rest of our family and made me prince over God's people, over Israel. Oh yes, I'll dance to God's glory, more recklessly even than this. And as far as I'm concerned, I'll gladly look like a fool. But among these maids you're so worried about, I'll be honored no end." Michal, Saul's daughter, was barren the rest of her life. Now, perhaps that last bit sounds a bit harsh, but if we look at it metaphysically, beyond the literal, I believe it's saying that such rejection and judgment cut us off from God. Such rigidity leaves us barren, if you will. The Jewish people, and by extension Christians, descend, therefore, not from the house of Saul, since Saul's daughter was barren, but rather from the house of David, this occasionally ecstatic dancer. And yet, the history of dance and Christianity is an interesting, but sadly all too often antagonistic one. The earliest Christians reacted to the pagan practices around them in the Roman Empire and saw great abuse and carelessness with other people. So they set themselves up in opposition. According to church leaders and early theologians, such as Tertullian and St. Augustine, dance incited idolatry, lust, and damnation. Medieval church councils railed against dancing, specifically censuring immoral, effeminate, and mixed dancing. And violators could actually be excommunicated. One author at the time wrote, "The devil is guide, the middle, and the end of the dance. As many paces as a man maketh in dancing, so many paces doth he make to hell." Now, men of that time saw dancing as one of the evils of women, pointing to Salome's dance as proof. She tempted Herod with her exotic dancing, and John the Baptist died as a result. And there's a whole story in the Bible about it. But the moral was, you see, she did that with her wicked dancing. And they added that to the story of Eve to prove that all things feminine are suspect at best and often mortally sinful and dangerous to the soul. And many of these attitudes have survived right through to the 20th century. See Footloose or Dirty Dancing. And here in New York City, dancing was forbidden in bars from 1926 until 2017, 6 years ago. I remember seeing the signs that said, "No dancing," and if you danced, the owner would come up and stop you. Now, a certain form of courtly dance flourished during the Renaissance, with intricate moves like you might see on Bridgerton, so that one needed to hire an instructor and have time to practice in order to master them. This meant, in other words, that their dancing was refined and not at all vulgar like the lower classes. And this attitude also survives to this day with respect to going to classic forms like ballet and eventually modern dance, while so-called street dancing is not to be taken seriously. So where there is passion and spontaneity involved, it seems in history, there has often been a dominant narrative of derision. Now we might ask, why? Why is dance so often banned or restricted? Well, it's often been associated with losing control of one's body and of a wild nature not compatible with good Christian behavior. Many have seen drunkenness and violence often coupled with loud, out-of-control dancing and connected them. Now, certainly, if we get lost in the physical realm exclusively, it can lead to a nihilistic shallowness and possibly to addictions that harm ourselves and others. But rather than look at the inner causes of this, we've tried to simply outlaw the external results, banning dancing or drinking. Think about prohibition in this country. And did that work? We must also admit, I believe, that sexism, classism, and racism have played a major role in the judgment of and restriction of dance. We are serious and pious, some seemed to say, unlike them, whether it was people of color, women, or gay men, or any other group people wanted to control or negate. The divine feminine was pushed down in many official church spaces, disempowered in the official hierarchy, so that people had to find that divine feminine elsewhere, often from the Virgin Mary, who held that loving energy, that sense of compassion in a way that people couldn't imagine from a man, even from Jesus. In its rejection of Catholicism, early Protestants also rejected what they saw as the cult of Mary. And by refocusing almost exclusively on the text of the Bible and its literal meaning, and by rejecting Catholic rituals, they cut off not only the feminine energy, but you could say the bodily connection in favor of a thought-based dualistic dominance paradigm. You're good or bad, saved or damned. Compassion, if you think about it, is irrelevant in that narrative. Some of the Catholic elements that early Protestants rejected brought spirituality into the body in real ways. Incense, for example. In his book, The Eternal Christ, Father Richard Rohr speaks of the Eucharist as originally being a bodily event, a profound ritual which takes God into our body through Christ as Jesus. And he points out that it must have sounded shocking in its time, especially to Jews who saw blood as unclean, not to be touched. But it was a visceral way of getting this Christ energy, one could say, into us, remembering and embodying that reality, the Word becoming flesh, if you will. Father Rohr also points out that Jesus' first miracle in the book of John was turning water into wine in order to extend a wedding feast, a huge party with dancing and, of course, alcohol. Yet, he says, quote, much of later Christianity has been rather prudish and ashamed of the human body, which God took on so happily through Jesus and then gave away to us so freely in the Eucharist. Our incarnation is to be celebrated, not denied or escaped. We can dance like David and reclaim our spiritual joy, our fullness. But I think because of this history I'm discussing, we've too often cut ourselves off from our inner lives, those scary impulses and feelings, the passions, tenderness, the intuition and guidance, the still small voice. We say seeing is believing because we trust only that which can be seen externally. Men, especially, are trained not to feel, and we're taught to mock things that are not grounded in fact and substance as nonsense, something outside the five senses. Hearing, seeing, touching, smelling, and tasting. Anything else doesn't matter. It doesn't count because we cannot quantify it. So where is inner feeling, Where is that sense? Emotions, spirituality, love. Our Puritan ancestors feared sexuality and dancing and anything that got us in touch with our inner selves. Misogyny flourished in this environment. Women burned as witches. And this has tragic consequences, not just for women, but for gay men, and I would argue for men in general as well, limiting what is acceptable to a kind of toughness, where anger is strong, but tenderness and joy are not. As men, we build things and figure things out, but our inner lives suffer if we're not in touch with that realm and are taught to avoid it at all costs. This kind of inner connection to and expression of passion has far too often been completely outside the realm of Christian expression. Episcopal Bishop John Shelby Spong used to joke that if the Jews were the chosen people, his congregants were the frozen people. Now, certainly many churches have included movement and passion, especially when the African-American churches, Pentecostal as well. But sexism and racism and homophobia have all contributed in our history to a rejection of dance and passion as beneath us in the dominant popular narrative. As we bring our bodies back into our spiritual expression, as we allow more passion in the music we use, we can begin to have a truly full spiritual experience in church. And this expands the appeal of church, inviting more of us in and inviting more of us into the space. Such a body-positive music and movement-positive take on our spiritual lives finds expression not only in Jesus' first miracle, but throughout the Bible. The Psalms, after all, were songs. How is it that David and his descendants were dancers officially, but the church has taken the path of Michal, Saul's daughter, who rejected such joyful bodily celebration of God? Sometimes it's helpful to look to other traditions for inspiration. The Sufis, for example, really celebrate dance. It's integral. As Rumi put it so perfectly in the 1200s, "Whosoever knoweth the power of the dance dwelleth in God." Compare that to the earlier quote. Now, here's what Wikipedia says about Rumi. Rumi believed passionately in the use of music, poetry, and dance as a path for reaching God. For Rumi, music helped devotees to focus their whole being on the divine, and to do this so intensely that the soul was both destroyed and resurrected. It was from these ideas that the practice of whirling dervishes developed into a ritual form. 100 years later, another Sufi poet emerged, one who memorized not only the Quran, but also, they say, the complete works of Rumi. This poet, therefore, was called one who remembers, or Hafiz. I'd like to close today with a poem by Hafiz, written sometime in the mid-1300s. And I think it beautifully expresses and lifts up the message that I'd love for you to take with you today. Here is that poem. I know the voice of depression still calls to you. I know those habits that can ruin your life still send their invitations. But you are with the friend now and look so much stronger. You can stay that way and even bloom. Keep squeezing drops of the sun from your prayers and work and music and from your companion's beautiful laughter. Keep squeezing drops of the sun from the sacred hands and glance of your beloved. And my dear, from the most insignificant movements of your own holy body. Learn to recognize the counterfeit coins that may buy you just a moment of pleasure, but then drag you for days like a broken man behind a smelly camel. You are with the friend now. Learn what actions of yours delight him, what actions of yours bring freedom and love. Whenever you say God's name, dear pilgrim, my ears wish my head was missing, so they could finally kiss each other and applaud all your nourishing wisdom. Oh, keep squeezing drops of the sun from your prayers and work and music, and from your companions' beautiful laughter, and from the most insignificant movements of your own holy body. Now, sweet one, be wise. Cast all your votes for dancing. Thank you.